The rain came down in merciless sheets, transforming the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory into a vast sea of mud. Yorick Wade pulled his hat lower, squinting through the downpour as thunder crashed overhead. That's when he saw her, a lone figure staggering along the road, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other trying in vain to hold a tattered shawl over her head. His heart dropped at the sight. No woman, especially not one in her condition, should be out in this weather. Yorick clicked his tongue, urging his horse forward. The animal snorted in protest but obeyed, splashing through puddles that had formed in the wagon ruts. As he drew closer, he could see the woman's soaked dress clinging to her pregnant form, her dark hair plastered to her pale face. "Madam!" he called out over the storm. "Madam, are you all right?" She turned toward him, revealing eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. For a moment, he thought she might bolt like a spooked deer, but then her shoulders sagged, as if the last of her strength had finally deserted her. Yorick swung down from his saddle, boots sinking into the mud. "My ranch is just over that ridge," he said, gesturing to the west. "You'll have shelter and rest there." The woman studied him with wary eyes. "Why would you help me?" Her voice was barely audible over the rain, but he caught the slight tremor in it. "Because no decent man would leave anyone out in this," Yorick answered simply. "Especially not." His eyes flickered to her belly. She nodded slowly, one hand protectively cradling her unborn child. "I'm Gabriella Ackerman," she offered, her teeth chattering from the cold. "Yorick Wade." He shrugged out of his oilskin coat and draped it around her shoulders. "Can you ride?" "I haven't much choice, have I?" There was a flash of spirit in her eyes that surprised him. Yorick helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. He could feel her trembling against him as they rode toward his homestead, and he found himself wondering what circumstances had brought a pregnant woman to be wandering alone in such weather. The year was 1878, and the Wyoming Territory was no place for the faint of heart, let alone a woman in her condition with no one to protect her. His ranch came into view as they crested the ridge, a modest but solid cabin with a small barn and corral beside it. Smoke rose from the chimney, a welcome sight in the dreary landscape. "Home sweet home," Yorick said, pulling up to the cabin. He dismounted quickly and reached up to help Gabriella down. Her legs nearly buckled as her feet touched the ground, and he caught her by the elbows to steady her. "Thank you," she murmured, her face flushing with embarrassment. "No need for thanks," he replied. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." The cabin was simple but neat. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in one corner, while a narrow bed occupied another. A curtained alcove suggested an additional sleeping area. Gabriella stood dripping on the plank floor, looking uncertain and out of place despite the warmth of the room. "You need dry clothes," Yorick stated, disappearing behind the curtain. He returned with a clean flannel shirt and a pair of woolen trousers. "These will be too big, but they're dry. You can change behind there." He nodded toward the curtain. "I'll make some coffee." Gabriella accepted the clothes with a grateful nod and disappeared behind the curtain. Yorick busied himself with the coffee pot, trying not to think about the woman changing just a few feet away. It had been 2 years since he'd shared his home with a woman, not since Sarah had died of fever. The thought of his late wife sent a familiar pang through his chest. "Mr. Wade." Gabriella's voice pulled him from his memories. She emerged from behind the curtain looking like a child playing dress-up in her father's clothes. She'd rolled up the sleeves and pant legs, and tied a piece of rope around her waist to keep the trousers from slipping down. Despite the comical appearance, Yorick couldn't help but notice how the firelight caught in her damp hair, highlighting strands of copper among the brown. "Just Yorick," he said, pouring 2 cups of coffee. Sit by the fire before you catch your death. He handed her a steaming cup. It's not fancy, but it's hot. Gabriella sank into the chair nearest the hearth, wrapping her hands around the mug. I don't know how to thank you. You can start by telling me what you were doing out there, Yorick said, taking the other chair. It's not exactly promenade weather. A shadow crossed her face. I was heading to Laramie. I have a cousin there who said she'd take me in. Laramie? That's still 20 miles from here. Yorick frowned. How were you traveling? I was on the stage, but... She looked down into her coffee cup. There was an incident in the last town. The driver refused to let me continue. What kind of incident? Gabriella's hand went instinctively to her belly. The kind that makes men look at a woman without a husband and decide she's not fit for decent company. Yorick's jaw tightened. The baby's father? Dead, she said flatly. 6 months ago. Mining accident in Colorado. Her eyes met his, challenging him to judge her. We were married. Not that it seems to matter to most folks once they see a widow with child and no ring. Yorick felt a flicker of shame for his assumption. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Ackerman. Gabriella, she corrected softly. Or Gabby. And thank you. She took a sip of coffee, wincing slightly. Are you in pain? Yorick asked, noticing her discomfort. Just tired. And the baby's been restless today. She managed a small smile. Probably doesn't appreciate being jostled around in the rain. Yorick nodded, unsure of what to say. He'd never had children with Sarah, though they tried. Another regret to add to the pile. You can have the bed, he said, changing the subject. I'll sleep near the fire. Gabriella looked as though she might protest, but exhaustion won out. Just for tonight. Tomorrow I'll continue to Laramie. We'll see, Yorick said noncommittally. The stage doesn't come through for another 3 days, and that's if the creek doesn't flood the road. For now, rest. After finishing her coffee, Gabriella made her way to the bed. Yorick busied himself with banking the fire and laying out his bedroll, giving her privacy. By the time he'd finished, her breathing had already deepened into sleep. Yorick stretched out on his bedroll, listening to the rain hammering on the roof and Gabriella's soft breathing. It had been a long time since he'd had company in his cabin. He wasn't sure how he felt about it yet. Morning brought clear skies, but confirmation of Yorick's prediction: the creek had indeed overflowed its banks, making the road to Laramie impassable for at least a few days. Gabriella took the news with surprising composure. I appreciate your hospitality, she said over breakfast, but I don't want to impose. Perhaps there's work I can do while I'm here. Yorick raised an eyebrow. In your condition? I'm pregnant, not invalid, she replied crisply. I've been taking care of myself these past 6 months. I'm quite capable. Yorick found himself smiling at her spirit. All right. I could use help with the mending and cooking if you're offering. And so they fell into an unexpected routine. Yorick would tend to his small herd of cattle and the few horses he kept, while Gabriella managed the cabin. She proved to be an excellent cook, transforming his basic provisions into surprisingly tasty meals. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Yorick working on his leathercraft, Gabriella sewing or reading from one of the few books he owned. They spoke little of their pasts at first. Yorick learned that Gabriella had been a schoolteacher before marrying her husband, Thomas. They'd moved to Colorado for the mining opportunities, only for Thomas to die in a cave in just 2 months after they discovered she was expecting. The company gave me his final wages and their condolences, she said quietly one evening. But the boarding house wouldn't keep me once they realized my condition. Said it would upset their other tenants to have a woman in my state around. That's not right, Yorick said, his hands pausing in their work of tooling a leather belt. Right doesn't seem to matter much when you're a woman alone, Gabriella replied with a sad smile. My cousin Martha is my only family now. She wrote that I could stay with her in Laramie until the baby comes, maybe teach at the school there. Yorick nodded, understanding her determination to reach Laramie. You'll get there, he assured her. Once the road's clear. 3 days stretched into a week as heavy rains continued intermittently, keeping the creek high. Yorick found himself in no hurry for the roads to clear. There was something comforting about returning to the cabin each evening to find it warm and welcoming, with Gabriella's presence bringing life to spaces that had felt empty for too long. One afternoon, Yorick returned from checking his fence line to find Gabriella standing in the yard, hanging laundry on the line. The sight of his shirts flapping beside her dresses created an unexpected tightness in his chest. You shouldn't be doing that, he called as he dismounted. The doctor in town told Sarah that reaching above her head wasn't good for women in your condition. Gabriella turned, raising an eyebrow. Sarah? Yorick froze, realizing what he'd said. My wife, he admitted after a moment. She died 2 years ago. Fever took her. Gabriella's expression softened. I'm sorry, Yorick. I didn't know you were a widower too. It's not something I talk about much, he said, taking the wet sheet from her hands and hanging it himself. But yes, I understand something of what you're going through. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Yorick felt a connection that went beyond simple hospitality. Here was someone who understood loss, who knew what it was to have dreams shattered and futures rewritten in an instant. The moment was broken when Gabriella suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her belly. What is it? What's wrong? Yorick asked, alarmed. To his surprise, Gabriella laughed. Nothing's wrong. The baby's kicking. Here. Before he could react, she took his hand and placed it on her rounded belly. Yorick stood frozen, feeling the strange sensation of a tiny foot or hand pushing against his palm. That's remarkable, he breathed. It is, isn't it? Gabriella's eyes shone with a joy that transformed her face. No matter what else happens, this little one reminds me there's still wonder in the world. Yorick nodded, unable to find words for the emotions stirring within him. He helped her finish hanging the laundry, then insisted she rest while he prepared supper for a change. That evening marked a shift in their relationship. They began to speak more freely of their pasts of Sarah and Thomas, of hopes that had been dashed and dreams they'd once shared with their spouses. Sarah always wanted children, Yorick confessed one night. We tried for 5 years. The doctor finally told us it might never happen. She was heartbroken. I'm sorry, Gabriella said softly. Thomas and I had barely begun to plan our future when I found out I was expecting. He was so excited. Her voice caught. He painted a little wooden horse for the baby. It's one of the few things I couldn't bear to leave behind. The next day, Yorick rode into town for supplies. The creek had finally receded enough to make crossing possible, which meant the stage would likely be running again soon. The thought brought an unexpected heaviness to his heart. In town, he found himself lingering at the general store, examining fabrics and baby items that had never caught his attention before. He ended up purchasing soft flannel for swaddling cloths and a small wooden rattle that the shopkeeper's wife had crafted. For the little one, he said gruffly when he presented them to Gabriella that evening. Every baby needs something new. Gabriella's eyes filled with tears as she ran her fingers over the gifts. Yorick, you shouldn't have. It's nothing, he said, embarrassed by her emotion. Just practical things. No, she shook her head. It's kindness, and that's never nothing. That night, as they sat by the fire, Gabriella sharing stories of her teaching days while Yorick worked on a small carving, he realized he was happier than he'd been in years. The thought of her leaving for Laramie created a hollow feeling in his chest that he wasn't ready to examine too closely. The next morning brought news that the stage would be running again the following day. Yorick delivered this information over breakfast, watching Gabriella's face carefully for her reaction. "Oh," she said, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. "That's good news." But her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You could stay longer," Yorick found himself saying, "if you wanted, at least until the baby comes. It might be safer than traveling in your condition." Gabriella looked up, surprise evident in her expression. "Yorick, I couldn't impose—" "It's not an imposition," he interrupted. "This place has felt more like a home in the past week than it has in 2 years. And He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I've grown accustomed to your company." It wasn't what he truly wanted to say, but it was all he could manage. How could he tell her that in just a week? She'd brought color back into a world that had faded to gray after Sarah's death. How could he admit that the thought of her leaving made him feel as though winter was returning to his soul? "I've enjoyed your company too," Gabriella said softly. "More than I expected to enjoy anyone's company again. But Yorick, I can't stay here indefinitely. I need to think of the baby, of our future." "And what kind of future do you see in Laramie?" "Teaching while trying to raise a child alone." "A practical one," she answered, a flash of steel in her eyes. "One where I can support myself and my child with dignity." Yorick nodded, respecting her determination even as he wished he could change her mind. "The offer stands. Whether it's for another week or longer, you have a place here if you want it." The day passed in a strange tension, both of them aware of the impending separation but neither willing to speak of it directly. Gabriella packed her few belongings while Yorick made arrangements to drive her to town the next morning. That evening, a spring storm blew in suddenly, bringing with it howling winds and driving rain that lashed against the cabin windows. They sat by the fire, the storm outside mirroring the tumult of emotions within. "Reminds me of the night you arrived," Yorick commented, trying to break the awkward silence that had fallen between them. Gabriella nodded, her fingers working on a piece of mending. "I thought I was going to die out there," she admitted. "I'd been walking for hours after the stagecoach left me. When I saw you riding toward me, I was almost too exhausted to feel fear." "You never did tell me why the driver put you off the stage," Yorick said. Gabriella's hands stilled. "There was a man in the last town, a businessman, who took an interest in me. When I rebuffed his advances, he told the driver I was a woman of ill repute, trying to pass off my condition as widowhood." Her voice was bitter. "The driver believed him over me, said he couldn't risk his reputation carrying such passengers." Yorick's hands clenched into fists. "What was his name? This businessman?" "It doesn't matter now," Gabriella said, looking up at him with surprise. "Why?" "Because no man should treat a woman that way without consequence," Yorick said, his voice hard. "Especially not a woman in your situation." Gabriella's expression softened. "That's very gallant of you, Yorick Wade. But I've learned that fighting such battles often costs more than winning them is worth." A crash of thunder shook the cabin, causing them both to jump. Gabriella gasped suddenly, her hand flying to her belly. "What is it?" Yorick was on his feet in an instant, moving to her side. "I don't know," she said, her face pale. "A pain sharper than the baby kicking." "Is it time?" Yorick asked, his heart racing with panic. "Is the baby coming?" "It's too early." Gabriella shook her head. "I still have weeks to go." She winced as another pain gripped her. "But something doesn't feel right." Yorick helped her to the bed, his mind racing. The nearest doctor was in town. A good hour's ride in good weather impossible in this storm. "What can I do?" he asked, feeling helpless. "Just stay with me," Gabriella whispered, clutching his hand. "Please don't leave me alone." Throughout the night, Yorick stayed by her side as the pains came and went. Sometimes they seemed to ease, giving them hope that it was a false alarm, only to return with renewed intensity. By dawn, both were exhausted, but the pains had subsided to occasional twinges. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean world and the sounds of birds greeting the morning. Yorick opened the window to let in fresh air, then returned to Gabriella's side. "How are you feeling?" he asked, noting the dark circles under her eyes. "Better," she said, though her voice was weak. "But I don't think I should travel today." "No," Yorick agreed emphatically. "The doctor should see you first. I'll ride into town and bring him back." "Yorick!" Gabriella caught his hand as he turned to go. "Thank you for everything." He squeezed her hand gently. "Rest. I'll be back as soon as I can." The ride to town was the fastest Yorick had ever made, his fear for Gabriella spurring him on. Dr. Mills was fortunately in his office when Yorick arrived, and after hearing the situation, agreed to come immediately. "Early labor pains, most likely," the doctor explained as they rode back. "Not uncommon, especially after stress or physical exertion. Most times they stop on their own, as seems to have happened with Mrs. Ackerman. But the baby will be all right." Yorick pressed. Dr. Mills gave him a curious look. "You seem mighty concerned for a woman who's just passing through, Wade." Yorick didn't respond, but the doctor's observation forced him to confront feelings he'd been avoiding. He was concerned more than concerned. The thought of anything happening to Gabriella or her child filled him with a fear he hadn't felt since the night Sarah had fallen ill. At the cabin, Dr. Mills examined Gabriella thoroughly before delivering his verdict. "False labor," he confirmed. "But you need rest, Mrs. Ackerman. Complete rest for at least a week. No traveling, no housework, nothing strenuous." "A week?" Gabriella looked dismayed. "But my cousin is expecting me." "Would you rather risk delivering your baby on the stagecoach?" Dr. Mills asked bluntly. "Because that's what might happen if you ignore my advice." After the doctor left, with promises to return in a few days to check on her, Gabriella lay back against the pillows with a sigh. "I seem destined to impose on your hospitality even longer," she said to Yorick. "It's still not an imposition," he assured her, sitting beside the bed. "And now you have a good reason to accept my offer to stay until the baby comes." Gabriella studied his face for a long moment. "Why are you doing this, Yorick? Really? You've gone far beyond what anyone would expect from a stranger offering shelter from a storm." Yorick looked down at his hands, rough and calloused from years of ranch work. "Maybe because I know what it's like to face the world alone," he said finally. "After Sarah died, I thought I wanted solitude. Turns out what I really wanted was peace. And somehow, having you here has brought more peace than 2 years of being alone." The admission cost him, but it felt right to finally speak the truth. Gabriella's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I've felt it too," she confessed. "This past week it's the first time since Thomas died that I've felt like I could breathe again. Like maybe there's still a future worth hoping for." Yorick took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Then stay. Not just for a week or until the baby comes. Stay longer. See if what we've found here is something worth building on." "You hardly know me," Gabriella protested weakly. "I know enough," Yorick replied. "I know you're brave and determined. I know you make this cabin feel like a home again. I know that when you smile, it makes me want to be a better man." A tear slipped down Gabriella's cheek. "And what about the baby? Taking on another man's child isn't something to decide lightly." "That child is part of you," Yorick said simply. "How could I not welcome it?" Gabriella didn't answer immediately, but she didn't pull her hand away either. "Let's take this week," she said finally. "Let me rest, as the doctor ordered, And let's see if what we feel now is still there when the crisis has passed. It was a sensible answer, and Yorick respected her caution. A week it is, he agreed. True to the doctor's orders, Gabriella rested for the next several days, while Yorick took over all the household duties in addition to his ranch work. He was no cook, but he managed simple meals and brought them to her proudly. In the evenings, he would read to her from one of his books, or they would talk for hours about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their dreams, the lives they'd imagined for themselves before loss had changed their paths. By the fourth day, Gabriella was feeling well enough to sit in a chair by the window, watching as spring began to transform the landscape. Yorick found her there when he returned from checking on a new calf, her face tilted toward the sunlight, hands resting on her belly. "The doctor says the baby's growing well," she told him, smiling as he entered. "He thinks it will be a strong child." "Of course it will," Yorick said, setting down his hat. "With you as its mother, how could it be anything else?" The compliment brought a blush to Gabriella's cheeks. "Dr. Mills also said I could start moving around more tomorrow, as long as I don't overdo it." "That's good news," Yorick said, though a part of him had enjoyed caring for her. "I've been thinking about that empty room on the north side of the cabin. It would make a fine nursery with some work. It needs a proper window, for one thing." Gabriella looked at him with surprise. "You're planning a nursery?" "Just thinking ahead," he said, suddenly self-conscious. "In case you decide to stay." A slow smile spread across Gabriella's face. "I've been thinking about that too. About staying." Yorick's heart quickened. And I think perhaps I've been too hasty in my plans. Laramie will still be there after the baby comes. Maybe." She hesitated. "Maybe we could see what this is between us without the pressure of an immediate decision." It wasn't exactly what Yorick had hoped for, but it was more than he'd had before. "I'd like that," he said, unable to keep the joy from his voice. The following week brought full spring to the Wyoming range. Wildflowers bloomed across the prairie, and the air was filled with the sounds of new life. Gabriella grew stronger each day, taking short walks with Yorick when he could spare time from his work. One evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "I never paid much attention to sunsets before," Yorick admitted. "Too busy thinking about work or worrying about cattle prices." "That's a shame," Gabriella said, her shoulder touching his as they sat side by side. "My father used to say that sunsets are God's way of reminding us that endings can be beautiful too." "Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. He taught school in a small town in Nebraska for 40 years. "He's the reason I became a teacher." Gabriella's voice softened with memory. "He would have liked you, I think." "Would he?" Yorick found himself pleased by the thought. Yes, he valued honesty and hard work above all else. And kindness. Her hand found his, fingers intertwining. "You've shown me more kindness than anyone since Thomas died." Yorick turned to look at her, seeing how the fading light gilded her profile. Without thinking, he leaned forward and kissed her gently, hesitantly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Instead, her free hand came up to touch his face, and she returned the kiss with a sweetness that made his heart ache. When they finally parted, Yorick rested his forehead against hers. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Gabriella Ackerman," he whispered. "And it terrifies me." "Why?" she asked softly. "Because I've lost someone I loved before. The thought of risking that pain again." "I know," Gabriella nodded, her eyes understanding. "I feel the same fear. But Yorick, what if the alternative is worse? What if we let fear keep us from finding happiness again?" Yorick had no answer for that, but as they sat watching the last light fade from the sky, he knew she was right. The risk of pain was the price of love, a price he was increasingly willing to pay. As Gabriella's time grew nearer, Yorick worked feverishly to prepare the nursery. He installed a proper window to let in the morning light, built a sturdy cradle from oak, and even fashioned a rocking chair that he placed near the window. Gabriella sewed curtains and quilts, her nimble fingers creating a nest for the child who would soon join them. They still hadn't spoken definitively about their future, but their actions spoke volumes. Yorick found himself planning improvements to the cabin, a larger kitchen, another bedroom, maybe a proper porch where they could sit on summer evenings. He caught Gabriella studying his bookshelf one day, making notes about titles that would be suitable for teaching children to read. 2 weeks before Gabriella's expected time, a letter arrived from her cousin Martha in Laramie, expressing concern about her delayed arrival. Yorick watched nervously as Gabriella read it, fearing it might rekindle her desire to leave. "I should write back to her," Gabriella said finally, folding the letter. "Let her know I'm safe and explain the situation." "What will you tell her?" Yorick asked, trying to sound casual. Gabriella met his gaze steadily. "The truth, that I found shelter from a storm and perhaps something more. That I'm not sure what the future holds, but right now, I'm where I need to be." Relief washed over Yorick. "And where is that, exactly?" "Here," Gabriella said simply. "With you." It wasn't a declaration of undying love or a promise to stay forever, but it was honest, and it was enough for now. That night, Yorick lay awake long after Gabriella had fallen asleep in the bed they now shared chastely, him atop the covers, her beneath them, his presence a comfort against the night fears that sometimes still plagued her. He listened to her soft breathing and felt the occasional movement of the baby, visible even through the quilts. He thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought them together: a storm, a chance encounter on a muddy road, a woman in need and a man with an empty house and an emptier heart. If any one of those elements had been different, they would never have met. The thought made him shudder. In the morning, Yorick rose early as usual to tend to his chores. When he returned to the cabin, he found Gabriella at the table, a piece of paper before her and a troubled expression on her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, hanging his hat by the door. "I received another letter," she said, pushing it toward him. "From a lawyer in Denver. It seems Thomas had mining shares that I didn't know about. They've finally sorted out the paperwork and determined that I'm the rightful heir." Yorick scanned the letter quickly. The shares weren't worth a fortune, but they represented a substantial sum, enough for Gabriella to establish herself comfortably wherever she chose to go. "This is good news, isn't it?" he said, though he couldn't quite keep the worry from his voice. "It should be," Gabriella agreed. "It means security for the baby, independence for me." The word hung in the air between them. Independence. Freedom to choose her own path without having to rely on the charity of others, whether her cousins or his. "And is that what you want?" Yorick asked carefully. "Independence." Gabriella looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Once it was all I thought I wanted. To be beholden to no one, to make my own way." She laid a hand on her belly. "But people need each other, don't they? There's no shame in that." "No," Yorick agreed. "There's no shame in needing someone, or in being needed." "I've been thinking about what this money could mean," Gabriella continued. "It could mean a larger house someday, better equipment for the ranch, maybe even a proper school on this side of the creek for the children around here." Yorick's heart leaped at her words. "You're thinking of staying, then? Not just until the baby comes, but longer?" "I'm thinking," Gabriella said with a small smile, "that I'd like to see what we could build here, together." Yorick crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside her chair. "Gabriella, I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a short time, but I love you. I think I started falling in love with you that first night by the fire, when you showed more courage in the face of your circumstances than most men I've known would have. Gabriella's eyes filled with tears. Yorick. Let me finish, he said, taking her hands in his. I'm not asking you to forget Thomas, just as I'll never forget Sarah. They're part of who we are. But I believe there's room in a heart for more than one love in a lifetime. And if you'll have me, I'd like to spend the rest of mine loving you and this child. A tear slipped down Gabriella's cheek. Are you asking me to marry you, Yorick Wade? I reckon I am, he said with a crooked smile, though I'm making a poor job of it. I should be down on one knee proper like. You're on both knees already? Gabriella laughed through her tears. And yes, I'll marry you, not because I need your protection or your home, but because I love you too. Yorick pulled her into his arms as carefully as her condition would allow, his heart fuller than he'd ever thought possible again. They would be married by the circuit preacher when he came through in 2 weeks' time, just before the baby was due to arrive. Those 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparations. Yorick rode to town to purchase a simple gold band and to invite Dr. Mills and a few neighbors to witness the ceremony. Gabriella wrote to her cousin Martha, explaining everything and inviting her to visit once the baby had arrived. The wedding day dawned clear and bright. Gabriella wore a new dress of blue calico that Yorick had bought in town, with wildflowers in her hair. Yorick wore his best shirt and a new pair of trousers, his hair slicked down in an unsuccessful attempt at neatness. The preacher arrived mid-morning, followed by Dr. Mills and 3 neighboring families who lived within riding distance. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, with Yorick's voice breaking as he promised to love and cherish Gabriella for all his days. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher declared. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Wade. Yorick kissed Gabriella tenderly, mindful of her condition and the audience. The small gathering applauded, genuinely happy for the couple who had found love in unexpected circumstances. After a simple wedding feast prepared by the neighboring women, the guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in the cabin that was now truly their home. Mrs. Wade, Yorick said, savoring the sound of it. How are you feeling? Happy? Gabriella replied, leaning against him as they stood on the porch watching the sunset. And enormous, she laughed, patting her belly. This little one seems determined to make a grand entrance. He'll be here soon enough, Yorick said, his hand joining hers. He? Gabriella raised an eyebrow. You sound very certain. Just a feeling, Yorick shrugged. Though I'll be happy either way. As will I, Gabriella agreed. As long as the baby is healthy, nothing else matters. That night, they lay together in the newly expanded bed that Yorick had built in anticipation of their marriage, his arm draped protectively over her as she nestled against him. I never expected this, Gabriella murmured sleepily. When Thomas died, I thought my chance at happiness had died with him. I felt the same after Sarah, Yorick admitted. It's strange how life surprises you. Gabriella agreed, already drifting towards sleep. The best kind of surprise. Yorick lay awake a while longer, listening to his wife's breathing and feeling the occasional movement of the child that would soon be, in all the ways that mattered, his own. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, the grief they'd both endured, the chance encounter in the rain, the slow blooming of love from the seeds of kindness and respect. 3 days after the wedding, in the quiet hours before dawn, Gabriella woke with a gasp, clutching her belly. Yorick, she whispered, shaking him awake. It's time. Yorick was instantly alert, his heart racing with both excitement and fear. I'll fetch Dr. Mills, he said, already reaching for his clothes. There's no time, Gabriella said, gripping his arm as another contraction seized her. The baby's coming fast. You'll have to help me. Panic flashed through Yorick, but he forced it down, nodding resolutely. "Tell me what to do." The next hours were the most intense of Yorick's life. He boiled water, gathered clean linens, and supported Gabriella through increasingly powerful contractions. She was brave beyond measure, biting back screams and focusing on her breathing, as he encouraged her with words that felt inadequate in the face of what she was enduring. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Gabriella gave one final, powerful push, and their child slid into Yorick's waiting hands, a son, red-faced and squalling with healthy lungs. "A boy," Yorick said in wonder, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he wrapped the infant in a clean blanket. "Gabriella, you have a son." "We have a son," she corrected tiredly, reaching for the baby. "Oh, Yorick, he's beautiful." Yorick placed the child in her arms, then sat beside them on the bed, overwhelmed by the love that surged through him at the sight of his wife and newborn son. The baby had a thatch of dark hair and, when he briefly opened his eyes, they were the deep blue of all newborns. "What shall we name him?" Gabriella asked, looking up at Yorick. "I've been thinking of Thomas as a middle name to honor his father, but the first name should be one we choose together." Yorick considered for a moment. "What about Elijah? It was my father's name." "Elijah Thomas Wade." Gabriella tested it, smiling down at the now quiet bundle in her arms. "I think it suits him perfectly." Dr. Mills arrived an hour later, summoned by a neighbor Yorick had sent for as soon as the baby was safely delivered. The doctor examined both mother and child, declaring them healthy and strong. "You did well, Wade," Dr. Mills said, clapping Yorick on the shoulder. "Not many men could have kept their heads in such circumstances." "I had an excellent teacher," Yorick replied, glancing at Gabriella, who was dozing with the baby nestled against her. The next weeks passed in a blur of joy and exhaustion as they adjusted to life with a newborn. Elijah proved to be a good-natured baby, with his mother's expressive eyes and what Yorick swore was already a determined chin. Visitors came to welcome the new arrival, neighbors bearing gifts and food, Dr. Mills checking on his patients, and eventually, Gabriella's cousin Martha, who arrived on the stage from Laramie with curiosity about the man who had so quickly captured her cousin's heart. "I see now why you stayed," Martha said after spending a day observing Yorick with Gabriella and the baby. "He loves you both very much." "Yes," Gabriella agreed, watching as Yorick walked the floor with a fussy Elijah, singing off-key but with such tenderness that it didn't matter. "We've been very fortunate." "Fortune had little to do with it," Martha observed wisely. "You both chose to open your hearts when it would have been easier to keep them closed. That takes courage." As summer turned to fall and fall to winter, the little family settled into a rhythm of life on the ranch. Yorick used some of the money from Thomas's mining shares to hire a young man from town to help with the heavier work, allowing him more time with Gabriella and Elijah. They began to make plans for expanding the ranch in the spring, adding more cattle and perhaps building a larger home as their family grew. On the anniversary of the night they'd met, Yorick surprised Gabriella with a gift, a small silver locket containing a tiny portrait of Elijah that he'd commissioned from an artist passing through town. "To remind you always of that stormy night and what came of it," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "As if I could ever forget," Gabriella replied, touching the locket reverently. "That was the night my life began again." They stood together at the window, watching as another spring storm rolled across the Wyoming prairie, lightning illuminating the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes. In the nursery, Elijah slept soundly, secure in the knowledge, even in his infant understanding, that he was loved and protected. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found you that night?" Yorick asked, his arm around Gabriella's waist. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I look at you and Elijah, at our home and the life we're building, and I know that somehow we would have found each other anyway. Some things are just meant to be." Yorick pulled her closer, thinking of all the twists of fate and choices that had led them here to this moment. This life, this love that had healed wounds they'd both thought would never mend. "You'll have shelter and rest," he'd promised her that night in the rain. He couldn't have known then that she would give him the same shelter for his heart and rest for his soul. A home filled with love and the promise of a future brighter than either of them could have imagined in their darkest hours. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the walls of their home, all was warmth and peace and the quiet certainty of love that had withstood its own tempests and emerged stronger for the journey.